Welcome to the group that has decided they want to hear about secure by design, because this is something where I think the phrase has taken on a number of different meanings, and I think I want to define three that are of relevance to the Cenic community. I'll talk about one, Sandeep will talk about another one, and I'll hit a third one in passing. So this really is the agenda. We're going to first talk about what do we mean by secure by design, what are some of the different meanings of that phrase that have entered currency right now, how can you use this concept, as you set about making procurement decisions, as you set about providing services and security for your organizations. And then if you think this is a good idea, what's the alternative to secure by design? The status quo, frankly, non-secure by design. How can you help this kind of idea take off? So this is, at its essence, secure by design was an attempt to say, look, we need to move the paradigm from saying security is the responsibility of the user. The onus is on you to make sure that things work, to make sure that they work securely. We need to make this something that really is more the responsibility of the manufacturer of the technology, and that they should address that end to end, from conceiving of the idea through designing the product, through the manufacturer, through its use, and then to the retirement of the product. So it's not rocket science, frankly. It's the way a lot of other things in our lives exist. If something doesn't work, you certainly have recourse on product liability. You buy a car and it squeaks. When you take it off the lot, you'll bring it back to get the noise dealt with. So we've just given IT an exemption from the typical standards that we have been applying, that have said the manufacturer really has got a fairly high bar to clear. And let me talk about the three kinds of secure by design. There's the one that really was created by government and has been built out by industry. I'm going to explain what that one is about. There's one where Cenic members are doing it. Sandeep is going to talk about that. And then there's a third one that really focuses more directly on software. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that one right now because we're not going to dwell on it again. It's also frequently labeled secure by design. I suspect you probably have heard of the Secure Software Development Framework. You've probably heard the term SBOM, Software Bill of Materials. These are things that came out of the federal government, but they're a way of saying we can do DevSecOps. We can have libraries of APIs and functions that are open source, but they contain modules that have had the vulnerabilities mitigated in them, that are code-signed versions, so we know these are not buggy, they don't have malicious code in them. That, frankly, the one that is really about DevSecOps, is, I think, going to be one that will become increasingly important as we get into the world of AI generating code at a greater scale. And that's legitimately secure by design, but that's not really one that we're going to focus on for this discussion. The one that I'm going to focus on really came to prominence in the Biden administration cybersecurity strategy that was put out in 2022. That was very much the brainchild of the first national cyber director after that position was created by Congress. Was a guy named Chris Inglis, who'd been a longtime peer of mine in government. I spent 33 years in the federal government, all of it working in the three-letter agencies of the intelligence community. Chris Inglis did also. He was the deputy director of the National Security Agency, and then went to the private sector. And then when they asked him to come back to be the first national cyber director, Chris very much shaped the national cyber strategy, and he shaped it in large part around the idea that we've had a collective market failure in this country when it comes to cybersecurity. That when you made an IT product, doing cybersecurity was largely optional. If you were a user, doing the right thing and adhering to cybersecurity, again, was something that you didn't really get credit for. It was a cost center. And frankly, because this is Cenic, and I know we have a large educational community representation, Chris also said, and we have failed and in our approach to education in this country to make cybersecurity something that's embedded in it. When you could graduate from virtually any four-year computer security degree granting program in this country without having taken a single cybersecurity course, that's a problem. And so they said, secure by design is something that needs to be built into things. So that was 2022. And this was a white paper that came out of the US, and you can see there are, I believe, 14 allied countries, certs, that co-signed this, and at the top you had CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the National Security Agency, and the FBI. So you had the federal government's lead for cybersecurity, for intelligence and information assurance, and law enforcement, basically being the primary drafters of this, with CISA being the biggest one. And then most of the major industrial powers of the Western world also signing on to this. And it was a way of laying out a set of broad tenets on secure by design. And this is what it said. It basically said, in principle number one, what I've already said, which is it's no longer acceptable to, in the name of being first to market and innovation, rush a product to market and then bolt security on after the fact. It shouldn't be your user's problem. You need to address it systematically. And the model that they took was the way we have addressed motor vehicle safety in this country, that certainly in my lifetime, there was a time where if you died in an accident, the assumption was you, the driver, had made a mistake. And it didn't matter that we had cars that would tip over at 25 miles an hour, that if you wanted a seatbelt, you had to buy a Volvo, that you learned to drive from dad even if it was a terrible driver. I mean, there was a litany of things that led to that and that we changed, but what arguably moved the needle more than anything else was starting to hold manufacturers responsible for making a safer car. And now we are where we are with self-driving and crumple zones and all the wonderful things. That was the model that led them to say, we really can do this. They said nobody writes bug-free code. So you need to be transparent and accountable. When you find problems, you not only need to fix them, you need to make them visible to everyone that there are problems and you fixed them. And this is not something that you can just handle at the cubicle level. You really needed buy-in from the top of a company to do this. Well, that's nice, but how do you turn this call to action into an action plan? So what happened, 2022 was the strategy, 2023 was this white paper. Into 2023, CISA turns to the IT sector, the coordinating council, because IT is critical infrastructure in this country, and CISA is the sector, the agency responsible for managing that sector. I sat on the coordinating council representing Fortinet on that. CISA said, we want to create a voluntary pledge for industry on secure by design. And I did lots of strategies, and when I was running the whole of government cyber programs for President Bush and Obama, I've done lots of big cyber things, and I said, CISA, you really need help on this. So I led the industry engagement with CISA that resulted in a voluntary pledge that was released at RSA in 2024. And I'm going to walk through the 7 items in that pledge. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the Secure by Design pledge. Over half that pledge is just table stakes and basic cyber hygiene. But I had personally said we needed to put those things in there because we kept seeing the same 3 or 4 root causes for compromise come up over and over again. So the goal was to create a pledge that small business could say, I'm a startup or a 50-person cybersecurity company. Is this something that I can realistically undertake? So let me walk through it. The companies that said they would sign the pledge agreed to do 7 things. The first was, and you said you would do them in a fashion that you would share with the public and with your customers. So this has got to be evidence-based. Multi-factor authentication. Show that you're visibly increasing the use in your products of MFA. No more default passwords. Okay, and these are two of the ones that are basic cyber hygiene, but they're consistently implicated in compromises going forward. The third one is frankly the only stretch goal out of the entire 7, because while we were looking for something that little manufacturers could do, we also recognized that the Fortinets and the Googles and the Intels of the world, we didn't want something so easy that we could sign the pledge and then the next day turn in our implementation report that showed we'd fully done it. This was a stretch goal because nobody's perfect. Everybody can say, I'll focus on specific classes of actions. The one Fortinet has chosen to focus on is reducing SQL injection in legacy code. We go back and serially look for that. But that's one that even the biggest companies can work on. Marching through the rest of the list, patching. You know, we're in a world where it's considered an okay norm now to patch the operating system by default, but still apps don't get patched by default. So this was a way of saying, can I find ways, whether it's patched by default, whether it's something to encourage customers to do that, where statistically we'll see this going up. Vulnerability disclosure policy. Will you come up with something that gives people safe harbor for looking for vulnerabilities in your code that will give them a place to report it? And this is one that seems really easy to do. Just get your legal counsel to look at it and then post the security.txt file. I'm surprised that so few companies that have signed the pledge have actually done it. And then the remaining 2 are common vulnerabilities and exposures, the CVEs that we all put up with. The reality is not all companies report them. And even many of the companies that report a CVE don't report the rest of the information that should go with it. What weakness, class, and what platform. It would be like saying, I'm a botanist, I want you to go out and collect samples for me, and you come in and you hand me leaves, individual leaves, and you don't tell me what kind of tree did it come off, what health of the tree was it in. Those are kind of things that somebody could figure out from the leaf, but if they're busy, they won't. So this was a matter of saying we need to do a better job of reporting vulnerabilities, because that's really what drives the data about how are we doing? Are we getting more or less collectively vulnerable? And then what are you doing to help your customers figure out whether they've been exploited, and if they have, can you show them what they should be looking for? So if you look at those 7 items, they're not going to make you fully secure by design, but they do start to establish a baseline. And that really was what we were trying to do, was create some transparency in the marketplace. 2024, it was released. 68 companies have signed it. It's grown 7-fold, so about 350. Now, numerically, that's a drop in the bucket. But if you look at the companies that have signed it, and you go to the CISA website to do this, the biggest companies in IT, I mean, if you added up the top 10 by market share, we probably have 2/3 to 3/4 of the IT products out there. So the big ones signed on to this as an idea. And then there's a handful of the smaller ones too. Now let me talk a little bit about the problem. This is, again, something that we all agreed was a good idea, was common sense. With the transition of administrations, this got labeled as a Jen Easterly idea, and it's been de-emphasized by this administration. The other international partners still think it's a good idea, and frankly, I have a global role, and I'm spending a lot of time working with them to continue it going. The upshot is only 15% of the companies that have signed the pledge have done what they said they'd do and post a report card on how they're doing on implementation. But theoretically, anyone who signed it said, I'm willing to share with you what I've done on implementation. So before I turn it over to Sandeep, how do I think you could use it? Well, the first way you could use this is as you're doing an RFP, as you're looking for vendors, with that 350 companies, I suspect there's someone in virtually any product niche that has signed the pledge. And then again, because the really big companies, as a rule, signed it, you can probably use this in your RFP to say, okay, did you sign the Secure by Design pledge? And if you did, are you willing to show me what you've done on implementation? It's not to say it can disqualify people who didn't do it, but this gives you an idea of who's taking doing the basics of cybersecurity seriously. I think that starts to bleed into the next one. You know, if you look at the things we described, most of those are basic cyber hygiene. So this becomes a way of saying this is what we organizations in the Cenic community expect our IT products to reflect. And I think part of this is if you're talking to a vendor who says secure by what, you just point them to the CISA page and say, this is a best practice. This is something we would like to see our vendors doing. Because, and I'll close by this was an opportunity to try to say we can use market forces and transparency to drive improvement in cybersecurity. It didn't have to be government regulation creating requirements. We could say if we establish smart baselines, and if we say, and we want to buy from vendors that are following those, then the vendors are going to deliver to where the market demand is. So if you think this is a good idea, this is a way to build on this momentum. So now I want to turn it over to Sandeep to talk about another meaning of secure by design.
Great, thank you, Jim. I'll take the clicker. Thank you. So let me talk about this from the perspective of how we see it from a services organization perspective. I am at the San Diego Supercomputer Center, where I lead a division primarily focuses on building secure enclaves. So security, cybersecurity, that's been part of my journey for over a decade. What is it at risk? These are just samples of the types of use cases we support. So you will see, we are working with higher ed researchers who are running cohorts, studying a population of teachers, or working with medical device organizations that are streaming data from the hospitals through their various monitoring devices, to looking at the risk posture within a university system, all the risks universities deal with in terms of their student and their staff and researchers they support. So you're really talking about a whole range of science and business use cases that are potentially at risk. And this is all real, right? I mean, we talk about incidents that happen across medical centers, across more of these episodes with whistleblowing, where organizations have to resolve false claims acts, especially you're seeing a lot of that in higher ed, in the DoD space, where they've introduced new regulations around how DoD controlled unclassified information is managed. And then the most recent one with Stryker, I mean, I think this happened a few weeks back. At the same time, we on campus, we were all asked to start registering our devices within Intune, and this incident happens. And so really puts things in perspective of what's secure, what you think was common practice may not necessarily be there. So how we've positioned ourselves is really kind of look at security through the various use cases and the various institutions we work with. And SDSC, as part of us, Cenic member, as part of the higher ed community, is really positioning itself to come up with different options for different use cases we come across, whether that's the use of cloud or on-premise resources or high-performance computing resources, right? And so through this portfolio, we're really able to serve a whole breadth of use cases. And, where does it all start? And so I think when we think about security, we've leaned in heavily on the NIST framework. NIST kind of provides you these different frameworks for how you can create a secure environment. Working with the government, there are very clear guidelines of the kind of templates and frameworks they expect you to leverage. You must have heard about things like NIST 800-53, which is the FISMA framework. More recently, in the CUI space, NIST 800-171. But all of these point to some very key tenets around security, right? There is physical security of assets. There is encryption. There is managing your operating systems. Jim talked about vulnerability management. Operating systems, if you talk about operationally, my team spends a good amount of their time just chasing vulnerabilities, right? So vulnerability scanning, malware protection, monitoring. And then you kind of come up through the stack, then you've got to have access control, policies, assessments, audits. So really you're talking about kind of this all the way bottom to top approach when it comes to security. And NIST also provides you reference architecture This is adopted in different shapes and forms when you work with different cloud platforms. I mean, the principles and the idea is the same, whether you're using a cloud platform or you're building your own on-premise, the idea being you protect the border. We work with partners like Fortinet, use the solutions they provide in terms of really protecting our borders. Defense in depth, you create segmentation, both vertically and horizontally across your app layers and your data layers, as well as your your test, dev, and production environments. And then you create a whole suite of system and security tools that really work and implement those controls that NIST calls out, right? And so going back to Jim's point about, you can't protect breaches. Those will happen because the actors are always ahead of you. But I think what you have to show is due diligence of having put these things in place and having the right controls. And so you have to trust and you have to put in the effort to work with vendors to ensure that they hold themselves to these standards, right? So we use a whole suite of enterprise products. Again, like I said, security tools, systems tools, many of these, I'm sure those who are in the IT space would have heard of these, but what does this mean? Before we look at a product or a vendor, we have to go through a certain risk assessment. More and more of these NIST frameworks and these controls call out the requirement around verifying a SOC assessment, ensuring that if you don't have the right documentation, can you do a HECVAT evaluation of these tools, right? There is, in the DoD space, they're actually requiring vendors. The only vendors you can use are the ones who are FedRAMP authorized, right? So they're even setting up a much higher standard. And so you got to ensure that you have a lot of this risk assessment in place to make sure that you are not using a product that's potentially being developed or running out of an entity that the United States doesn't work with, or it's on the banned list. In terms of doing your own assessments, I think there is a big need around how do you certify that what you've built kind of meets that standard. So there are options around it. Like I said, SOC 2 assessments, especially in the HIPAA space, dealing with healthcare. There is FedRAMP, and you're dealing with FedRAMP. These give you a certain level of approval from certified third-party assessors who verify that you meet those controls you say you're meeting. So I think these are good cues to look for when you're working with vendors and service providers out there offering cloud services. And I think just kind of, again, building on the tenets Jim talked about in the pledge, all these controls that you adopt from a NIST framework really map to a whole set of tools and services. Again, this is where typically the organization ends up spending their time, ensuring they have these tools in place, they're collecting all the data, they are able to provide evidence during an assessment or during an audit. Personnel services, people are background checked, who you are hiring, that they are vetted for certain criteria. And then again, going through the different compliance standards, ensuring that you can demonstrate that it's an annual effort. It's not once in 5 years. A lot of these requirements are now annual. So it's all about continuous monitoring. So which brings me to what does continuous monitoring? Again, things that we think are important. I mean, a lot of these controls you'll see in NIST frameworks, it consists of administrative controls, technical controls, security controls. But when you really break it down, what are essential pieces that really protect your assets? It's ensuring that you have a very strong vulnerability management program. You protect your boundary. You've got defense in depth. You have different layers of protection before someone can get to the data. You have jump boxes, MFA. I mean, that shouldn't even be a conversation. MFA for users, MFA for admins. jump boxes and bastion hosts, no accessing of systems directly from the internet. You have to land on a device within the secure environment behind the boundary, and from there you can access your other assets. Encryption, pretty basic, encryption at rest on all your storage devices, encryption kind of in transit, all the communication that happens within the environment and going out to the endpoint. Log management, to be able to collect all the logs and have some kind of a SIM for alerting, to have triggers for when you see something that's not typical, that you suspect is not what you're expecting in the environment. We talked about risk assessment. And another key one is shared responsibility. I think you can run a lot of things within your boundary, you can protect that boundary, but some responsibilities still fall on the end user. What devices are they coming from? BYOD, organization managed devices. And so, there have been new approaches to limit that, offering solutions like VDI. VDI is a remote desktop that can pretty much limit what end users can do. So that helps. But still, there are different types of risks that are there, especially if data has to leave the environment and data has to move through the enterprise. So it's important to establish kind of that responsibility and what you have the users acknowledge. So continuous monitoring is a big part of it. And how this translates to the cloud, I think a lot of people look at the commercial cloud. Cloud talks about a lot of their basic services being compliant, but that's only half the picture. They talk about security of the cloud, kind of the boundary and the services they offer, but you still have to build out the necessary set of services to make sure that security in the cloud is also addressed. So together, those two, you have to be mindful, especially from a compliance perspective. Just moving to the cloud doesn't give you security end to end. You still have to build out all the services I was just talking about, to really be fully secure. And so, how are we bringing this to the REN? I think this is, we started a partnership with one of the RENs, MCNC over in North Carolina, and my partner in crime, Phil Emmer here. We came up with this approach of bringing all our services to an existing REN that's already serving this community in North Carolina. And so, they, as part of their strategic plan, they had identified certain priorities. They already offer a number of services. And for them, this was a ready-made service that they could offer, right? And as part of this 5-year plan, our goal is to, on day one, be able to offer them services, and then over a period of time, duplicate the services we've built here in San Diego and California across the nation within MCNC's organizational boundaries. And so you kind of rent immediately, turnkey solution available, and then you build over time to create this. So the hope is we kind of establish similar partnerships with other RENs and let this network grow. And that's where I think events like this and partners like Cenic and other RENs could play an important role in bringing these capabilities through economies of scale at a much lower price than spending a large investment to get these things going. And so we've been able to do this for a number of higher ed institutions and research organizations. It just kind of talks about a sample of organizations we've worked with. So I will stop with that, and got a minute, so happy to take questions, comments.
So it's really two different similar types of secure by design. It's either something you can hold all the vendors responsible for, or, in the case of what Sandeep was talking about, something where they've gone through the pain of building that, but then they're finding ways to make it available more broadly. So any questions? We're happy to follow up afterwards too. Okay.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.